Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to welcome you to this evening's program of Radically Right. This is April 21st, 2007. Tonight's program is going to be centered around the deplorable conditions that our boys suffer at the hands of our own government when they go into the military and are captured by the enemy. As always, I'd like to start off each week's program with a prayer for those who are taking a stand against this New World Order. And I would ask, please don't just listen to me pray, but add your voice so that a multitude is praying together. Dear Yahweh, God of good, creator of all the universe, God of Abraham and his sons Ishmael and Isaac, our Heavenly Father, we thank you for your many blessings. We ask that you shelter us from the forces of evil. Bless our minds with discernment, and our voices with your word. Guide our steps that we may follow your way. Cause the New World Order to fail and its conspirators to be exposed and defeated. Give us courage, health, determination, and material resources. Keep us in the hollow of your hand, shrouded in your Holy Spirit. For we pray in the name of your only begotten Son, Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah. Amen. It's hard to fathom, but the truth is that our government politicians are responsible for abandoning American soldiers at the end of each war, going all the way back to World War I. When a young man is conscripted or volunteers military service to fight for his country, should not be abandoned. That is what happens in far too many instances. And if he doesn't make it back with injuries, his treatment at the VA hospitals are nearly as deplorable. With increasing frequency, Americans are wearing shirts and flying flags that point to the cause of the POWs and MIAs left behind. This occurs despite the official government statement that all have been accounted for. Officially. People display the POW MIA silhouette of a solitary head hung in anguish to show that they've not bought that lie. The politicians responsible for covering up this heinous crime of leaving American boys in the hostile hands should all be tried and suffer the official penalty for treason when they're found guilty. What was once classified national security has come to the surface thanks to Senator Jesse Helms, who was the ranking member of the minority of the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. And on May 23rd of 1991, the Senate published a booklet that was entitled An Examination of U.S. Policy Towards POWs, MIAs. And we're going to dig into that and cover a synopsis of what really went on. Please stay tuned. We'll be right back. This booklet that was published by the Senate in 1991, entitled An Examination of U.S. Policy Towards POWs/MIAs, is quite revealing. The synopsis reveals callously our sons were abandoned to a lifetime of slavery under abject cruelty. The integrity of media that found the story so unnewsworthy really should be questioned. And to encourage further exploration, a summary follows. And according to Senator Helms' cover letter, investigation into the agencies of the U.S. government responsible for POW/MIAs led to some very disturbing conclusions. Hundreds of documents and with POW/MIA families and friends led the minority staff of the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs to declare that despite public pronouncements to the contrary, the real internal policy of the U.S. government was to act on the presumption that all MIAs were dead. As a result, the senator's staff found that any evidence which suggested an MIA might be alive was uniformly and arbitrarily rejected. Now, this gets to rationalization. When you refuse to look at facts that disagree with theories, you are rationalizing. Facts do not have to conform to theories. Theories must conform to facts. All efforts were directed towards finding and identifying remains of dead personnel, even though the U.S. government's techniques of identification were inadequate and deeply flawed. Now, this disdain for government abandonment of our young men is shared by Colonel Millard A. Peck, who resigned as chief of the Special Office for Prisoners of War and missing in action. And it was Colonel Peck that had accepted the position with hopes of vindicating the government of rumors that our sons were abandoned. Instead, he resigned in disgust and confirmed that a cover-up and in progress. He referred to it as a mindset to debunk and said that any soldier left behind was in fact abandoned years ago. Senator Helms' minority report scorned the policy that persisted in saying there is no evidence of POWs or MIAs in Vietnam. All should be presumed dead, and evidence contrary should be discredited and dismissed. Now, this notion of dismissing all hope of finding any POWs is uncannily similar to the pattern followed in the earlier wars of the century. The negotiating techniques of the adversary in Vietnam, a denial that POWs exist, a demand for diplomatic recognition, and financial aid from the United States, a suggestion that POW MIAs might be found if recognition and money forthcoming. All of these had been seen before. They had emerged in U.S. dealings with communist regimes in 1917. As a result, it was necessary for Senator Helms to broaden the scope of investigation to study the historical background. The study that followed is based on an examination of hundreds of once secret cables, instructions, and memoranda now in the National Archives and the files of appropriate agencies. Now, the study began with a largely forgotten page of American history. The U.S. Expeditionary Force in Siberia in 1917 through 1919. The sudden rise of the Bolshevik regime, the creation of the Red Army, and the perceived threat to Allied armies and territory in Eastern Europe led to some pretty furious fighting near Murmansk. Thousands of Allied soldiers were captured by the Red Army. An attempt to secure their release in the face of the intransigent deception of Bolshevik diplomacy faded as the U.S. government lost interest. A series of parallel events occurred after World War II. The USSR government of Joseph Stalin seized control of hundreds of prisoners of war, including Americans. Millions of displaced persons were caught in Nazi prison camps as the Red Army moved into Eastern Europe. The secret cables of Ambassador Harriman and the classified accounting provided General Eisenhower made it clear Stalin refused to account for either POWs or civilians once he fell under communist control. While at the same time, Stalin demanded that Russian or Eastern European prisoners liberated by the West be forcibly returned to the Soviet Union. The Korean War is closer to present memories, yet documents from that period also suggested abandonment of American prisoners and a disinclination by the United States to follow up on their disappearance. Finally, the fate of POWs of the Vietnam War may be tied to the diplomatic history of the Paris Peace Accords of 1973. Now, some may agree, as Colonel Peck indicated, the real abandonment of the American POW MIAs took place at the Paris Peace Conference. The present POW MIA policies of the U.S. government are merely an implementation of flawed decisions taken at that time. The fact is, the Soviet and Asian communist regime view the POW MIAs as leverage for political bargaining, as an involuntary source of technical assistance and forced labor. There is, therefore, no compelling reason in communist logic to return POWs so long as political and economic goals have not been met yet. And the logic of the Vietnamese position required them to conceal, to dissimulate, to titillate, and to dole out actual information grudgingly, piece by piece, that always in return for very practical considerations. Now, this perverse thinking is shocking to Americans who are more straightforward and honest in their interpersonal dealings. Indeed, the policy began with Lenin. From the time of the Bolshevik treatment of POWs from the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I to the Soviet treatment of POWs in World War II, to the North Korean actions in the Korean War, and finally in the First and Second Indochina Wars, POWs, including MIAs, were used by communist regimes as cynical bargaining tools in contravention to international law. In 1973, the communist Vietnamese used POWs to blackmail the U.S. into providing them with millions of dollars in reparations. Both the Vietnamese and the U.S. government asserted Operation Homecoming, brought home all prisoners. The Vietnamese believed that they had a deal, albeit a dirty one, in which prisoners were to be exchanged for cold cash. It was a deal that was brokered by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger via secret hand-carried letters. Now, it would be perfectly consistent with the historical communist policy to hold back against their will even the remains of the dead to exchange for dollars at a later date. The evidence of this investigation must be weighed against the probabilities of that historical background. Now, most of this information is not well known by the American public. However, all of it is based on open source material, including official U.S. government documents that have been declassified and collected from official agencies through the Freedom of Information Act requests and research from the National Archives, Washington, D.C. U.S. problems in accounting for POWs did not suddenly emerge in the Second Indochina War. In fact, the basic communist tactics were already evident at the birth of the Soviet Union and the Bolshevik Revolution. Today, most Americans have forgotten that there were two main fronts during World War I. The Western Front, the center of Allied tension, which today still receives the most focus, and an Eastern Front, which occurred when the Bolshevik regime signed a treaty with Germans and withdrew Russian forces from participation with the Allies. The Allies grew apprehensive about the German threat to the ports of Murmansk and Arkin, and the Allied expeditionary forces to Siberia to protect the rear. As a result of the fighting against the Soviet Bolshevik forces around Archangel in 1918 and 19, there were many casualties, and eyewitness accounts of hundreds of U.S. and British and French personnel who just disappeared. The official cables from the U.S. military attaché at Archangel cited much lower numbers than the eyewitness reports of missing personnel. The U.S. government policy concerned these and others in the two categories of missing in action MIA, and killed in action, body not covered. We're going to get into this more right after this break. Please stay tuned. This is Radically Right with Jack Otto. We are going to take a bite out of the New World Order. Continuing on about the POWs that were left behind after World War I. In a 1930 memorandum from the U.S. Acting Assistant Chief of Staff of G2 about the alleged confinement of American officers and soldiers in Russian prison. And he stated the following, and I quote, "An administrative determination has been placed on each of their records that they were killed in action on the date they were reported as missing." Let me cover that again. An administrative determination has been placed on each of their records that they were killed in action on the day they were reported missing. On April 18th of 1921, the New York Times reported, quote, "The American prisoners held by the Soviet government in Russia have been told by the Bolsheviks that they are being held because the United States government has not made vigorous demands for their release." It was widely known that the Bolsheviks held many American POWs and other U.S. citizens against their will. In fact, the new Soviet government attempted to barter U.S. POWs held in their prison for U.S. diplomatic recognition and trade relations. And the United States refused, even though the Soviets had at one time threatened that, quote, "Americans held by the Soviet government would be put to death," end of quote. In response to the Soviets' demand for recognition and trade relations for the return of U.S. prisoners, President Harding's Secretary of State, Charles Evan Hughes, said, "The United States will not consider any suggestions of any character from that country, that government, until the Americans now held as prisoners are permitted to leave the country." And according to Herbert Hoover, in his book, An American Epic, Volume 3, page 427 through 433, it says, "Several months later, the United States concluded the Riga Agreement with the Soviet government to provide humanitarian aid to starving Russian children. The Riga Agreement had specific requirements that the Soviet authorities release all Americans detained in Russia to facilitate their departure. The government was expecting 20 prisoners to be released, but U.S. authorities were surprised when exactly 100 Americans were released. In fact, not all American prisoners held by the Soviets were released. The Soviets held some back, presumably for leverage in any future negotiations with the United States. However, in 1933, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt recognized the Soviet government, these prisoners were not released. And other than the apparent recovery of 19 sets of remains, no satisfactory accounting of POW MIAs held by the Soviets was made in the United States. Now, as noted earlier, an administrative determination had been placed on each of their records that they were killed in action on the date they were reported missing. As far as the United States government was concerned, these men were legally dead. Other than a small number of U.S. government officials with access to the intelligence and knew otherwise, these men were generally considered to be no longer alive. One such intelligence document dated November 20th, 1930, cites an affidavit taken by the U.S. Justice Department of Alexander Gruba, a Latvian American who was identified as a Russian seaman. He had been imprisoned in the Soviet Gulag in the infamous Lubyanka prison, where he states he saw 4 American Army officers and 15 American soldiers and civilians. group further warned that the U.S. government that any inquiry made to Soviet officials of specific individuals would result in their immediate execution. He was later transferred to Sullivan's Island prison, where there were many Americans. We must remember that the same false Jews from Khazaria are behind the communist movement just as they run America now, and their inclination is satanic. Satanists have no integrity. Refugees fleeing from Russia into Europe during the late 1920s continued to report that a number of Americans were still held by the Soviet government in forced labor camps. World War II was a decisive victory for the United States forces. The enemy unconditionally surrendered in both the European and Pacific theaters. Despite the victory, thousands and thousands of U.S. soldiers were never repatriated from prisoner of war camps, prisons, and forced labor and concentration camps. These American soldiers were being held in Nazi prison camps along with other Allied POWs and Nazi captives when they were overrun by the Red Army. We're going to talk about right after this break. Please stay tuned. We'll be right back. When the Red Army overran the Nazi concentration camps, the POW camps, and they came into Allied POWs and other Nazi captives. Literally, hundreds of thousands of Allied POWs who had been held by the Nazis, as well as millions of Western European citizens or displaced persons, came under Red Army control. This number increased because General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in Europe, decided to stop the U.S. and British drive eastward into Germany in order to wait for the Soviet forces driving west so that the U.S. and Soviet forces could meet in Berlin. Now, Dwight D. Eisenhower's West Point yearbook refers to him as a Swedish Jew, and affectionately called him Ike the Cuck. That's what his yearbook said. Now, we find from Congressman Carol Reese of Tennessee, who stated in the House of Representatives, according to the congressional record on page A1564 to A1568, we could have easily gotten to Berlin first, but our troops were first halted at the Elbe River. They were then withdrawn from that river in a wide circle, far enough westward to make Stalin a present of the great Zeiss optical and precision instrument works in Jena, the most important V-1 and V-2 rocket laboratory and production plant in Nordhausen, and the vital underground jet plant in Kalle. Everywhere we surrendered intact to the Soviets thousands of German planes, including great masses of jet fighters ready for assembly, as well as research centers, rocket development, scientific personnel, and other military treasures. When Major Vasily Vershenko, a Soviet tank commander that overran Stalag 4B, spoke to Martin Siegel, U.S. GI and POW, he was asked immediately when the Americans would be retrieved. Major Vershenko said he was primarily concerned with the Russian prisoners held in a separate compound at Stalag 4B who may have been cowards, traitors, and deserters. With regard to the repatriation of U.S. and Allied POWs now under Red Army control, the major said, and he stated, quote, the Russians and Americans have agreed to a pact wherein the Russians would receive credit for each POW return. The repatriation of U.S. POWs was a complex matter. Well, Martin Siegel became concerned and escaped with a friend, Corporal William Smith of the 9th Division, and their findings were identical to the convictions of U.S. Major General R.W. Barker, the Allied chief negotiator for the repatriation of Allied POWs under Red Army control. In a report to the Chief of Staff of the Supreme Allied Headquarters, Barker wrote that after more than 4 hours of discussion with his Red Army counterparts, the SHEF, that's the Supreme Headquarters of Allied European Forces, representative came to the firm conviction that British and American prisoners of war were in effect being held hostage by the Russians until deemed expedient by them to permit their release. And this latter point was further borne out by subsequent events. The Major Furzenko comment about economic credits were not wholly inaccurate. Weeks before VE, that's victory in Europe, Soviets requested a $6 billion credit line from the United States. That'd be equivalent to about $200 billion in today's dollars. And credits from the United States were, in fact, an active Soviet consideration. Throughout the repatriation period, indeed, the Secretary of State, prior to a mid-April 1945 meeting with his Soviet counterpart, Commissar Molotov, received a pre-meeting briefing memorandum, one of the points of which was the Soviet request for $6 billion. The Soviet rationale for not repatriating Allied soldiers and citizens, however, was motivated by a more complex and more repugnant reason than credits alone. In the memoirs of former Secretary of State under President Truman, James F. Burns, there appears to be a telling conversation the Secretary had with Molotov, the Soviet Commissioner of Foreign Affairs. And in September of 1945, several weeks after Japan's surrender, Burns recounted that while in London, Mr. Molotov had come to see me on instructions from Moscow, and he wanted to complain of the way in which the surrender terms with Japan were being carried out. He complained particularly about the way the Japanese army was being demobilized. It was dangerous, he said, merely to disarm the Japanese and send them home. They should be held as prisoners of war. They should do what the Red Army was doing with the Japanese, that it had taken to Manchuria. Make them work. No one can say accurately how many Japanese prisoners have been taken to the Soviet Union. In mid-1947, the best guess was that approximately 500,000 Japanese were still there. The problem of accounting for POW MIAs was complicated, but the Soviets were just as uncooperative in the repatriation of millions of displaced citizens. In Europe, as well as in the Far East, the Soviets guarded a sea of prisoners viewed as human capital and slave labor. These prisoners were not only Allied and Axis POWs, which also millions of displaced Western European citizens, as well as Eastern European citizens, who desperately wanted to flee from the Red Army-occupied territory. Now, nationalities of smaller countries like France, tragically, had some military, political, or diplomatic leverage with the Soviet government to secure the reparation of their citizens at the end of the war. As a result, tens of thousands of Dutch and Belgians and hundreds of thousands of French were never repatriated by the Soviets. The French in particular bore the brunt of the Soviet make-them-work policy among the Allies. The Japanese and Germans fared far worse. In May of 1945, General Eisenhower sent a cable to the Soviets asking for an explanation for the slow pace of repatriation of these citizens. More than 2 weeks later, Eisenhower was sent another cable to the U.S. military mission in Moscow with more detailed number of discrepancies. Again, Eisenhower requested a detailed Soviet response to his concerns over the unrepatriated prisoners of war and other Allied citizens in Red Army-occupied territory. The Soviets held more than 1 million, more Western Europeans than they were willing to admit. This caused the Dutch and French governments considerable anxiety, despite false Russian assurances that all prisoners had been settled. A U.S. intelligence report from OSSEIG files dated in April through May of 1945 may provide some insight into the fate of these prisoners. A Polish informant who was forced to serve in the German army was taken prisoner by the Russians in 1944. And he was kept for a time in the transit camp in Kaunas, then Minsk, until he was deported across Siberia to the Sovetskaya camp near Vladivostok. And at the end of April 1945, he escaped and tried to get to Europe. He was, however, arrested by the NKVD just beyond Moscow and placed in the POW and internee camp at Tambov, which was occupied by Germans, French, Americans, British, Dutch, and Belgians. The prisoners numbered, in the informant's estimation, well over 3,000. They were both military and civilian, mostly likely overrun by the Russians during the offensive. All prisoners were forced to work, and the food they were given was very bad and monotonous. They were housed not in huts, but in dugouts. The monotonous food caused some strange disease which made the legs and arms swell, and after a time, men afflicted with this disease died. The informant was told that 23,000 Italians, more than 2,500 Romanian and Hungarian prisoners, had died in this manner. There were also many casualties among the Poles and other nationalities. Prisoners in this camp included men of high culture and learning and great expertise in many fields of science. Informant observed that German engineers were employed on a special task, drawing up blueprints for a 4-engine aircraft capable of carrying about 500 men and achieve a speed, it was alleged, of 1,000 kilometers per hour. The Russians were extremely interested in these blueprints, and the men working on the invention were granted all possible facilities, both in work and conditions of life within the camp. Less than a month after the signing of the Yalta Agreement, Ambassador W. Averill cabled the following urgent, top-secret message from Moscow to President Roosevelt. Quote, since the Yalta Conference, General Dean and I have been making constant efforts to get the Soviets to carry out this agreement in full. We've been baffled by promises which have not been fulfilled. I am outraged that the Soviet government has declined to carry out the agreement signed in Yalta in its other respects, namely that our contact officers be permitted to go immediately to points where our prisoners are first collected, to evaluate our prisoners, particularly the sick, in our own airplane, or to send our supplies to points other than Odessa, which is 1,000 miles from the point of liberation where they are urgently needed. For the past 10 days, the Soviets have made the same statement that Stalin has made up to you, FDR, namely, that all prisoners are in Odessa or in trains there too. Whereas I have now positive proof that this was not true on February 26th, the date on which the statement was first made. This supports my belief that Stalin's statement to you is inaccurate. There appear to be hundreds of our prisoners wandering about Poland trying to locate American contact officers for protection. I'm told that our men don't like the idea of getting into a Russian camp. The Polish people and the Polish Red Cross are being extremely hospitable, whereas food and living conditions in Russian camps are poor. In addition, we have reports that there are a number of sick or wounded who are too ill to move. These, Stalin does not mention in his table. Only a small percentage of those reported sick or wounded arrived at Odessa. Odessa was a Black Sea port in the Ukraine, through which some 2,900 U.S. soldiers were processed and repatriated. It is the only camp in the entire Soviet-occupied zone in Europe which U.S. contact personnel were allowed. 6 days later, Ambassador Harriman sent another cable to Washington, this time to Secretary of State R. Stettnes Jr. It described the Soviet violations of the Yalta Agreement. Only one doctor team had been allowed to aid U.S. prisoners who were suffering serious hardships from lack of food, clothing, and medical attention. Ambassador Harriman urged that the Soviets be restricted in their movement on Allied soil until they lived up to their part of the Yalta Agreement. That recommendation was never followed. Never followed. All leaders on both sides of the fence are among the false Jews from Khazaria. They refer to themselves as the Ashkenazi. And even though the Soviets entered the war against Japan only 6 days before they surrendered, the Soviets were in on the spoils as though they had carried the part of China known as Manchuria was conquered by the Japanese. The Soviets claimed it was a portion of Greater Japan. Most people would say they were not Japanese territory, but hostages that should have been set free. The Soviets also got control of some of the northern islands of Japan, and with the acquisition came some Japanese prison camps holding Allied prisoners. In 1945, during the closing days of the war with Japan, U.S. military intelligence said, quote, mercy teams, end quote, were sent to China and Manchuria to arrange for the well-being of the Allied POWs in Japanese camps. And generally, Japanese troop commanders cooperated with the mercy teams, but the Soviets, as in Europe, and Chinese communists denied mercy teams access to certain areas under their control. An aside about the communist Chinese is that they, too, are false Jews in the upper echelon. Mao and his chieftains are of the Tao Kaio Kaio, another branch of the Khazar Jews. The Soviets even sent a delegation to Hanoi to forcibly repatriate any French Foreign Legion POWs in custody of the Japanese or who were identified as citizens of the Soviet Union. All were surrendered by the Allies to the Soviets. We've got a break coming up. Please stay tuned. We're going to be right back. Listen to our sponsors. Be ready to support them. So we find as we go back in this Senate Minority Report by Jesse Helms that brought out all the hidden information about POWs left behind from World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, that even though the Soviets were unwilling to send our boys back, they insisted that all their people be returned, and all were surrendered by the Allies to the Soviets. Many Soviet citizens did not want to return to Soviet-occupied territory. Since these citizens were captured by the Germans and recovered by Allied forces were often recovered in German work camp uniforms. They had been offered the choice of starving or entering a labor battalion, and most joined. Once repatriated to the Soviet Union, many of these Soviets were immediately imprisoned in slave labor camps. However, the Soviets sent to slave labor camps were considered lucky, since the others were often shot. As a result, Soviet citizens and soldiers in Allied control were extremely reluctant to be repatriated. The following description is an attempt by Allied soldiers to repatriate 399 former Russian soldiers by train to the Soviet Union. Quote, "All men refused to entrain. They begged to be shot. They resisted the entrainment by taking off their clothing and refusing to leave their quarters. It was necessary to use tear gas and some force to drive them out. Tear gas forced them out of the building into the snow, where those who had cut themselves fell exhausted and bleeding in the snow. 9 men hung themselves. One had stabbed himself nearly to death, and one other had stabbed himself and subsequently died. While 20 others are in the hospital for self-inflicted wounds. The entrainment was finally effected by 368 men who were sent off, accompanied by a Russian liaison officer on a train carrying American cards. 6 men escaped en route. A number of men in the group claimed they were not Russian. Although Soviets were not willing to return American POWs, the U.S. government did the antithesis. Every soldier and citizen of the USSR was returned to Russia whether they wanted to go or not. Millions did not to return to the harsh life under communism with its purges, slave labor camps, and purposely contrived famines. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was in charge of Operation Keyhole, which literally forced reluctant people from the communist bloc to go home. Not so sweet home. This proved Ike's work to hold the reins of the U.S. presidency as he dutifully implements the insider's policy. Whenever the subject of POW MIAs rear its ugly head in the back closets of the establishment media, it is accompanied by an attitude of great conviction that if ever there were any POW MIAs, no chance they're alive now. Whatever goes on, so does the slavery. We'll be right back. So we're talking about the POWs that were left behind and mostly in the hands of the communists from World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. And our government's efforts to force all the people back into the Soviet bloc that didn't want to go, even though the Soviets didn't send our people back. And Eisenhower's Surgeon General Kenner reported on May 30th of 1945 that 20,000 Americans remained under Red Army control, and on May 19th of 1945, a secret priority cable was sent by 5-star General Eisenhower to the Aguirre negotiators in Halle, Germany, in which he said numbers of U.S. prisoners estimated in Russian control 25,000. Now, nearly a month after General Dwight D. Eisenhower claimed that only a small number of U.S. POWs remained in Russian hands, Ike sent that secret priority cable to General Dean in Moscow that read, possibility that several hundred American prisoners of war liberated from Stalag Luft 1 berth are now confined by the Russian Russian Army in the Rostock area pending identification as American, and is reported by an American who recently returned from such confinement. Sergeant Anthony Shurg was one of the approximately 1,000 Air Force officers and non-commissioned officers who left Stalag Luft 1 immediately prior to assumption of control in Barth by the Red Army in order to obtain rumored air transport from Wismar. The group of 10 in which Sergeant Shurg traveled was arrested by Soviet or Russian soldiers and held in jails in Bad Dürboden, then Rostock. 10 other Americans were soon under similar circumstances in Rostock. Russian authorities demanded identification papers, which no prisoner possessed, and refused to consider dog tags as proof of American status. And after 25 days, he escaped from jail and made his way to British forces. The reason the Soviets kept U.S. POW MIAs may be difficult for people of integrity to fathom. First, for economic concessions, or as Major Vershenko stated, for credit, as a source of slave labor to rebuild their industrial base, to blackmail concessions and to recognition, to ensure that all citizens of the communist bloc were repatriated, even if reluctant, and to have someone that could read the repair manuals for the Lend-Lease goods given to the USSR by the U.S. Now, the daughter of one such Army officer, Major Wirt Thompson, was never told that in 1955, a German POW from the Soviet concentration camp system reported to the United States government that while he was in prison, he met her father. The German repatriated told American officials that Thompson told him that he had been imprisoned at Budinsketsky prison near Moscow, and also in the Tayshet labor camps after World War II. Not only was Thompson's daughter overwhelmed when she found out early in 1991 that this information existed, but she wondered how her family could have been told by the United States government in 1944 that Major Thompson had been killed in action and his body not recovered. Got a break coming up. Stay tuned. We'll be right back and talk more about the Korean conflict. The negotiations for POWs and MIAs after the Korean conflict was difficult because the U.S. did not have a decisive victory and had to dicker from a weak perspective. U.S. troops were led by communists high in the UN to an intentional defeat. The North Koreans eventually settled for an agreement wherein each side would release those prisoners who wish to return to their respective countries. And all they had to do if they wanted to keep somebody was to say, well, he didn't want to come back. Operation Big Switch was the name given to the largest and final exchange of prisoners between the North Korean and UN forces. This occurred over a one-month period because from August 5th, 1953, September 6th, 1953, approximately 14,200 communist Chinese POWs elected not to return to the People's Republic of China, while 21 American POWs elected to stay with the communist forces and are considered defectors rather than unrepatriated U.S. POWs. However, U.S. government documents state that the U.S. government knew that nearly 1,000 POWs and an undetermined number of some 8,000 MIAs were still held captive after Operation Big Switch, according to General James A. Van Fleet of the United States Eighth Army in Korea. That's according to the New York Times on August 8th of 1953. These POWs were never repatriated. Apparently, no one in the U.S. governmental authority really cares about them. The Assistant Secretary of the Army in January 1954 stated in a memorandum he wrote, "A further complicating factor in the situation is that to continue to carry this personnel in a missing status is costing over $1 million annually. It may become necessary to, at some future date, to drop from our records as missing and presumed dead." In fact, the Defense Department did drop them from DoD records, as were the non-repatriated U.S. POWs from the American Expeditionary Force in World War I and World War II. At the time of the official repatriation of Operation Big Switch, some returning Americans reported that the communists were holding U.S. flyers as political prisoners rather than POWs, and that these people would have to be negotiated through political challenge and channels. There were no political channels at the time, as the U.S. did not recognize North Korea. On November 23, 1954, Peking Radio announced that 13 of these political prisoners had been sentenced for spying. This announcement caused a public uproar and a demand from the U.S. citizens for legal leaders to effectuate their release. On September 6 of 1954, Squadron Leader Andrew R. Mackenzie, a Canadian flyer, was released by the Red Chinese at the Hong Kong border exactly 2 years after his capture in North Korea. Wing Commander Don Skeen, his brother-in-law, was sent from Canada to meet him. He gave a press conference and guardedly disclosed that Mackenzie was present with U.S. airmen. None of these were among those 11 sentenced as spies 2 weeks earlier. 7 years after Operation Big Switch, a Foreign Service dispatch to the State Department in Washington contained the names of 2 U.S. Korean POWs working in a Soviet phosphorus mine. The cable, sanitized by the United States government, originally contained the names of the 2 U.S. POWs, and according to the government, their names were blacked out to protect the abandoned POWs' privacy. It's absurd that the government would abandon these soldiers to a life of slave labor in forced captivity is attempting to protect same abandoned soldiers' privacy. It's far more likely that they are covering their own tracks. These abandoned soldiers would undoubtedly prefer that all Americans know of their plight instead of the few politicians who've done so much to cover up the truth. The Second Indochina War is better known as the Vietnam War. Referring to it as the Second Indochina War does not fully confess the degree that it was more than just the Vietnam War. The U.S. Cup where the French had failed and in turn met defeat. As a result, the U.S. was forced to negotiate from a weak position at the Paris Peace Conference. Once again, the U.S. was unable to guarantee the repatriation of all U.S. POWs and MIAs were alive, held captive. The United States chief negotiator at the Paris Peace Conference, Henry Kissinger, admitted as much in his book, Years of Upheaval, 1982. Kissinger wrote, and I quote, "Equally frustrating were our discussions of the American soldiers and the airmen who were prisoners of war or mission in action. We knew of at least 80 instances in which an American serviceman had been captured alive and had subsequently disappeared. The evidence consisted of either voice communications from the ground in advance of capture or photographs and names published by the communists. In On January 27th of 1973, an agreement to end war and restore peace in Vietnam was signed in Paris, France. Operation Homecoming began February 12th, and a total of 591 United States servicemen were repatriated. News reports and other documentation stated that the United States government knowingly left men, perhaps thousands of men, in the captivity of communist forces in Southeast Asia. Official U.S. policy is to assume that all not returned are dead. This is an unwarranted assumption and a rebuff to U.S. POWs left as slaves to communism. Henry Kissinger promised $3.25 billion in reparations to the North Vietnamese during the Paris Peace Conference. He later admitted to them that Congress would have to appropriate the funds. The Vietnamese decided to hold on to U.S. POW MIAs until they got the promised billion. Congress was not apprised of the contingency and was reluctant to send any funds to the North Vietnamese because of the carnage waged against their own people after the war and due to reports of torture by the returning U.S. POW MIAs. The final death knell for the payment of reparations to North Vietnam occurred a week later when the Armed Services Chairman F. Edward Ebert served notice he would introduce a proposal to prohibit any U.S. aid for Hanoi. The Louisiana Democrat also said his justification for President Nixon's request for $1.3 billion aid to Southeast Asia was either nebulous or non-existent. It was the very next day that the United States made its definitive statement that there were no more Americans alive in Southeast Asia, and that rumors did the families a disservice. The real disservice was covering up the abandonment of the original plan of Senator Helms' minority staff was to review the U.S. government's handling and evaluation of the life-citing reports of witnesses who claimed to have seen American military personnel alive in Southeast Asia. They provide tantalizing glimpses of POWs and MIAs who then vanished into the midst of a bureaucratic nightmare at the Pentagon. For Vietnam, the U.S. government has at least 1,400 such reports, including some coming as late as the 1990s. In addition, U.S. government has received thousands and thousands of secondhand reports, accounts full of vivid details such as, my brother told me, saw 11 American POWs being transported in a truck at such and such a place. Amazingly, the U.S. government has not judged a single one of these thousands of reports to be credible. See, this conflicts with the official policy that all POW MIAs are dead and therefore must not be credible. Someone needs to tell these bureaucrats that theories must conform to facts, and if there is a disagreement, then facts prevail and the theory must change. It is contrary to sense that all 1,400 reports are false, especially in the light of such obvious contradictions as the actual return of the unfortunate Private Robert Garwood in 1979. POWs who do not escape are charged with collaboration. Garwood was a battle casualty taken into custody by the North Vietnamese under fire. We're going to talk about his court-martial right after this break. After Bobby Garwood was taken under fire into the prison camps of the Vietnamese. And finally released in 1979, he had a court-martial as a collaborator and deserter, and it solved two problems for the U.S. shadow government. One, he was defined as an expatriate and therefore not a prisoner, though he lived in prison camps. Secondly, two-thirds of the live sightings were dismissed as Garwood. And the policy there was no credible evidence of living prisoners made it necessary to assume that other U.S. prisoners in those prisons could not and did not exist. Garwood was convicted of one count of simple assault on a fellow POW, one count of aid to the enemy by acting as translator, interpreter, and interrogator, one count of wearing black pajamas, the enemy uniform, and one count of transporting an AK-47 unloaded during a patrol. Whether these convictions added up to a meaningful collaboration with the enemy or not, it was never proven that he was a voluntary deserter. The U.S. government has collaborated with the communists more than he ever did, and it seems more like he was deserted than a deserter. On February 12, 1991, the director of the Department of Defense's Special Office, POW-MIA Affairs, Colonel Millard A. Peck, resigned in disgust and contempt for the government's policy of cover-up. Observers described Colonel Peck as a man who had accepted the position with high motives and a sense of deep dedication. Yet his letter of resignation shows that he felt he could no longer fulfill the demands of duty, honor, and integrity under the policies he was asked to implement. In his resignation, Colonel Peck confirms that a cover-up has been in progress. He speaks of a mindset to debunk, that is, to discredit witnesses rather than ascertain the truth of their statement. He says that there's no effort to pursue live sightings. He states that any soldier left in Vietnam, even inadvertently, was in fact abandoned years ago. He also criticizes the U.S. government's treatment of the families and friends of the POWs, MIAs. Now, these statements should be evaluated in light of Colonel Peck's long career of faithful service in the U.S. Army. And this includes 3 combat tours in Vietnam, for which he was awarded numerous medals for gallantry, including the nation's second highest award, the Distinguished Service Cross. These are serious charges forth by a man who knows their seriousness. Moreover, he is one of the few who have the intimate knowledge of the way that the U.S. government's POW MIA policy actually operates. Considering soldiers, civilians from World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam Wars, men and women from such countries as America, France, Britain, Japan, Belgium, etc., the communists literally have held billions as slaves and consistently lie about it. Probably all from World War I have died after a miserable life of slavery. Probably most from World War II have fallen to an identical fate. And if it's up to the U.S. government or the bankers who pull the strings, the same will happen to those left behind in Korea and Vietnam, as well as the wars in Cambodia and Laos. At this point, the only hope for these people is that Rambo may make a solitary charge in the face of the communists and single-handedly rescue those deserted souls abandoned by the very government they fought so valiantly to preserve. On a separate occasion, Senator Jesse Helms, Republican from North Carolina, tried to warn Americans about establishment insiders who are bringing this one-world design with a convergence of Soviet and American system as a centerpiece. The influence of establishment insiders over our foreign policy has become a fact of life in our time. It is an influence which, if unchecked, could ultimately subvert our constitutional order. In 1987, Senator Helms gave a speech in which he identified the organizations through which these insiders operate. A careful examination of what is happening behind the scenes reveals that all of these interests are working in concert with masters of the Kremlin in order to create what some refer to as a new world order. Private organizations such as the Council on Foreign Relations, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, the Trilateral Commission, the Dartmouth Council, the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies, the Atlantic Institute, and the Bilderberger Group serve to disseminate and to coordinate the plans for this so-called New World Order, called business, financial, academic, all official circles. We're going to be right back. Please stay tuned. It really is a shame that the news media have ignored Senator Helms' report and remarks, and Colonel Peck's angry revelation embodied in his resignation. I think it's time to cancel subscriptions and boycott the sponsors of network news because they deliver propaganda and not news. I want to read to you the words of Smedley D. Butler. He was born in 1881, died in 1940. He was Major General, U.S. Marine Corps, and I believe he was the only double recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, and he summarizes the situation precisely. The normal profits of a business concern in the United States are 6, 8, 10, and perhaps 12%, but wartime profits, that's another matter. 20, 60, 100%, 300%, even 1,800%. The sky's the limit. Oh, of course, it isn't put that crudely in time of war. It's dressed speeches about patriotism, love of country, and we must all put our shoulders to the wheel, but the profits jump and leap and skyrocket and are carefully pocketed. In the World War I, a handful garnered the profits of the conflict. At least 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires were made in the United States during the World War. How many of these war millionaires shouldered a rifle, dug a trench, knew what it meant to go hungry in a rat-infested dugout, spent sleepless, frightened nights ducking shells and shrapnel and machine gun bullets, parried a bayonet thrust of an enemy, or were wounded or killed in battle? You know, the general public shoulders the bill for wars. The bill renders a horrible accounting. Newly placed gravestones, mangled bodies, shattered minds, broken hearts and homes, economic instability, depression, and all attendant misery. Back-breaking taxations for generations and generations. Those who are looking ahead to war are not the people, not those who fight and pay and die. War pays high dividends, but what does war with the men who were killed? What does it profit their mothers and sisters, their wives and their sweethearts? What does it profit their children? Yes. And what does it profit the nation? We use propaganda to make the boys accept conscription. They were made to feel ashamed if they didn't join the army, so vicious was the war propaganda that even God was brought into it. With few exceptions, our clergymen joined in the clamor to kill, kill, kill. War is a racket fought by the common man for the benefit of the rich. If it had been anyone but the courageous winner of 2 Congressional Medals of Honor for his valor, the media would tar and feather the spokesman for cowardice, for criticizing the military-industrial complex. A hero like Smedley D. Butler is not so he can vilify, and his accusations stand, but not covered in the media. Those who do turn from the battlefront are not always treated respectfully. The wounded received shameful treatment at the VA hospitals. Government wants to take over all medical care for everyone and probably will do so under President Hillary Clinton. The young men who were exposed to Agent Orange in Southeast Asia suffered greatly for it. When they got sick, their superiors accused them of malingering, trying to get out of work, and ordered them back into battle. And after their tour of duty was over, these same men were accused of fabricating their own diseases so government would not have responsibility. It was not until the death toll soared and an avalanche of lawsuits swamped the courts that the truth was reluctantly recognized. The soldiers from Iraq are subjected to the same treatment. Newspaper and television are unwilling to cover the scourge of illness that comes from handling of DU, that depleted uranium. Unfortunately, the DU is not really depleted, and we should expect that something with a half-life of 4 billion years is not going to be depleted after a century of use. The official denial of harm is thin and illogical. The Patriot underground became aware of the problem when one of the soldiers was hit with friendly fire. His sickness was denied superiors, and when one of his pieces of shrapnel worked its way out of his back, he had it analyzed. He sent it to his father, who worked in Los Alamos laboratories, and the father subjected this DU to a Geiger counter and found the subject's pegger, as that is, it registered to be extremely hot. The official and his media, officialdom and its media, have not recognized the danger, even though returning soldiers are sick and having deformed babies. Like Desert Storm Syndrome and Agent Orange denial found. Because the plan is to reduce the human population on Earth. This is accomplished through war, disease, medicine, abortion, and poison in the foods and water. I want to remind you, as I do each week, that freedom isn't free. And if you're not doing all you can, not what the stakes are. The stakes are our children. Are they going to live free, or are they going to be slaves of an all-powerful superstate that has the right to say what's good for them? See, that's the difference between socialism, government tells you what's good for you, and a constitutionally limited republic. You can do what you want, so long as you do not encroach upon someone else. But do what you can to support freedom. I would suggest that you support Republic Broadcasting Organization, because freedom isn't free. Make a check out to CSIN. It's like an acronym for Christian Soldiers Informing Neighbors. CSIN. And send it to the Republic Broadcasting Organization at 1015 South May. That's Suite 100 in Round Rock, Texas. Round Rock, Texas, where the zip code is 78664. I would like to program up to input from the listening audience. The number you can call is 1-800-313-9443 if you wish to be part of this conversation. And I would ask that you don't waste any time praising me or condemning me or bragging about your contribution to the Patriot movement. Let's use whatever time we've got to go after the New World Order people. That's 1-800-313-9443. After the show, you'll be able to call me if you like, and let me give you my contact points. My name is Jack Otto, OTTO. You can write me at Post Office Box 256 in Dearborn Heights, Michigan. That's Dearborn Heights, Michigan, where the zip code is 48127. My home phone number, and again, I would ask you not to call until the show's over. My home phone number is area code 313-582-2481. We see that our boys were abandoned by our own government. So they put their lives on the lines for the country. And they were abandoned to the Soviet Union, and you have to note that that Soviet Union was exactly the people that run us now. The Yiddish-speaking false Jews from Khazaria who have literally run their tentacles through front organizations into the control and containment of just about everything. We find that through their organizations like AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, life here in America is effectuated in the direction they want to go. A friend of mine out in Arizona, Mike, sent me some papers recently from the Forward, which is a Jewish newspaper, paper of the Jews, for the Jews, and by the Jews. And in that Forward, they indicated that the mainstay of the AIPAC, American Israeli Political Action Committee, funds are going to Hillary. Say, the fix is in. Hillary is going to be our president, unfortunately. She will preside over much of the destruction of America. We're going to see during her reign that the purchasing power of the dollar is going to diminish greatly, and it's going to take a lot of dollars to buy your essentials. Luxuries are about to fall by the wayside. And you can mark my words that when she's in, she's going to work on that program that she tried to get when her husband was president, and she was just the dragony behind the scenes. And that program is that we're all going to have national health cards. And they're not really interested in making sure that everybody is healthy. If they did, they would curb that Food and Drug Administration that brings out such dangerous medicines with so many side effects and allow some of the natural things to be utilized, even though they're a lot cheaper. But the real reason is not because they want us to be healthy, but because they want us to be controlled. And they want us to have that national ID card so that we may be tracked. We're not supposed to be folded, spindled, or mutilated, but that's exactly what's coming up here. And with the control of foods, they're going to squeeze us down. It was Henry Kissinger that said, if you wish to control a nation, control the energy. But if you want to control the people, control the food. And we can see in biblical admonition that we are at the time of the end. And as time goes on, there's going to be a shortage of wheat, barley, and oil. And you can put some of that away now. If you put wheat in a plastic container with diatomaceous earth, make sure it's good and dry wheat, the shelf life is going to be long. Just keep that plastic out of the sun. If you make yourself some jerky and pack in plastic buckets with salt, shelf life is almost forever. Because as those POWs suffered greatly in their camps, their prison camps. You can find out that when push comes to shove here and the emergencies are declared and you go to the shelters, it's a mistake. Because those shelters are prison camps. We have had a lot of military bases and a lot of underground structures made throughout the country by FEMA just for that purpose. They may not have been prepared very well for the Katrina or Hugo hurricane, but they have been prepared for the prison camp. Just thank you, folks, for listening. Again, freedom isn't free. Do what you can to support your Republic Broadcasting Organization. God bless you, folks. Good night. May Yahweh look over you and watch over you and yours.